So we'd like to know what is the best way to describe for people to understand better the difference between the two.
Well, great. Yeah, I'll take a crack at this and with a focus on the definition of refugee, and then maybe I'll pass the microphone over to Attorney Sennett and she can talk about asylum seekers. So the international law definition of a refugee, and I think a lot of the listeners are probably already aware of this, so excuse me if I'm telling you something you already know, but the international law definition of a refugee is a person who has fled his or her home country because of persecution. Either they have suffered persecution and they can prove it, or they have a well-founded fear of persecution and they can prove that. Persecution because of their race, their religion, their nationality, membership in a particular social group, or their political opinion. That's the international law definition of a refugee. And that is also the US government's definition of a refugee. And someone who has been granted refugee status is eligible to come to the United States through the Refugee Resettlement Program, providing they pass through a security vetting process. But someone who is trying to get refugee status is often referred to as an asylum seeker because they're seeking asylum, which is basically the same as seeking refugee status. But Attorney Sennett, you want to talk a little bit about asylum seekers, especially as it is in the news today?
Sure. So I think that's a great explanation and overview. When I practice immigration law, which involves asylum seekers and applying for asylum. And when we talk about asylum, we like to talk about refugee status and asylum status as two sides of the same coin, because an asylum seeker has to prove that they qualify as a refugee. So the same persecution or fear of persecution based on having one of those protected characteristics that Chris just talked about. And the main difference that people in the United States would see is how that person is coming to the United States. So as Chris mentioned, refugees are being screened and vetted abroad. They're determined to be a refugee while they're outside of the country. And then they're being brought in through resettlement agencies like the one that I work for and the one that Chris works for and directs. The asylum seeker is, so basically the US government allows a person who's present in the United States or who's presenting themselves at the border to apply for asylum, to try to demonstrate that they should have this same refugee status. So when a person comes in and they are applying, they're not applying for refugee status, because that's something that would have been determined before they arrived. They're usually applying for asylum. So the same protections that a refugee would receive, but they're already here in the United States looking for that.
Okay, thank you very much for your description. Sorry, my dog is barking. Now I'd like to move on to more of the US policy part of this. So Attorney Sennett, I'd like to ask you, how have US policies discriminated against refugee and asylum groups, and how detrimental this can be to these groups?
So over the course of the last administration, we saw some very significant changes in both refugee policy and asylum policy. And it would be very, if we made a list of this would take pages and pages to discuss. So In terms of refugees, one of the things that was done was that in 2017, former President Trump signed an executive order that suspended certain refugee resettlement, particularly the resettlement of Syrian refugees. And hand in hand with that was, so you may have heard about the Muslim travel ban, which affected 7 Muslim majority countries. That also extended to refugees. So that means that there were certain people who may have already been identified as refugees, may have begun the process of resettlement, who suddenly found themselves ineligible to be included. And as we've, during the course of the administration, so the executive office, or the president, basically sets a cap on how many refugees we can resettle. Under President Obama, that was over 100,000 per year. Under the Trump administration, it steadily decreased, with former President Trump setting that at 15,000 before he left office. So if you can imagine, the United States was the leading refugee resettler. We resettled more than any other country, and we are now down to 15,000, which is really significant. There have been a series of court decisions and basically decisions by the Attorney General of the United States with regards to who is allowed to seek asylum, or who is allowed to get that benefit. And that particularly affects people who were seeking asylum based on gender, and also people who were seeking asylum based on issues related to gangs. In the last year of former President Trump's administration, he tried to dramatically limit asylum by passing this massive new rule through. And fortunately, that has been held up by the courts. It is not going into effect, but it would have basically eliminated asylum as we know it. So that's a shorthand of what we've seen over the last several years. I don't know if Chris wants to add anything, particularly with regards to the refugee policy.
Yes, I mean, in 2015, 2016, during the presidential campaign, then candidate Trump was calling for really an end, a total end to the refugee program. He even at one point said he wanted to send all refugees back to the countries they came from. Of course, would be illegal. He actually did follow through on his campaign promise, partially, to ban Muslims from coming to the United States. So the Trump administration, in many ways, seemed determined to destroy the U.S. government refugee resettlement program. As Caroline mentioned, we used to have the largest refugee resettlement program in the world. We brought more refugees to the United States than all of the other governments with refugee programs put together. And that number has historically been between 80 and 100,000. Now, the Biden administration promised during its campaign to restore the soul of America that they would restore the refugee resettlement program. There is nothing more American than welcoming persecuted people from all over the world and helping them start new lives. So the number that they proposed to bring every year to the United States is 125,000, which is a big change from 15,000. And for this shortened year, ending September of 21, the number was going to be 62,500. Now, last Friday, someone issued an announcement that appeared to be either a mistake or very poor judgment, saying that the Biden administration in looking out at the refugee program and how it had been crippled during the Trump administration. They only felt they could bring about 15,000 to the United States. Well, that prompted an enormous outcry. So, the bad news is that somebody made that announcement. The good news is the response was very powerful and immediate. And the White House, within an hour, walked back its announcement and say, no, we didn't mean that. And we'll get back to you in the next month or so with a new number, but it'll probably be less than the 62,000.
Okay, thank you for those insights. So we've been speaking a lot about resettlement for refugees. So this one is for Chris. And so how has your organization, IRIS, helped refugees in settling down in new locations in general, and how has that changed as a result of the COVID pandemic?
So, good question. We provide basic services that all of the 200 or so nonprofit groups that resettle refugees provide. And it begins with housing, which we have to find and furnish even before the refugees arrive. We will meet the refugees and get them settled into their apartment. We will connect them to healthcare. Often that's a high priority. We'll enroll the children in school. We'll help the adults learn English, and we'll help the adults get jobs. We also have legal services, as does SERI, to help with family reunification if necessary. So these are sort of the basic services that all refugee resettlement agencies provide. Most of them either have legal services or can refer them to legal services. The pandemic has led to a drop in the number of refugees coming to the United States, but actually far worse than the pandemic was the impact of the Trump administration. So the numbers were already very low under the Trump administration, and then they got even lower due to the pandemic. Refugees still arrive. They're tested for COVID-19 before they're allowed to get on flights to come to the United States. When they arrive in the United States, we will meet them and whisk them away to their apartment where they have to isolate for 2 weeks if they've not been vaccinated. And many refugees come from countries where vaccination rates are much lower than they are in the United States. So the key point is Trump administration really devastated the refugee resettlement program much more than the pandemic has. And it is gradually recovering. But even during the Trump years, refugees were arriving. And even during the Trump years and the pandemic, refugees were still arriving, and we were following these precautions.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if Attorney Sennett, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I would say that it has been challenging because one of our goals is to make refugees comfortable in this new chapter of their life, to show them around, to take them to this. Usually we would take them to the school, show them where the children get picked up, how things work, introduce them to the people in their community. And under COVID, that is a very different situation. So just thinking about having children who have remote learning, who are going to need laptops or other electronics for that, who might not know how to use those electronics, connecting people to resources and to other people in their community when people are largely wearing masks, which makes it more difficult to interact. And masks also what we found is that it makes it difficult to understand people, even more so than you would normally, especially if someone's speaking with an accent, especially if English isn't their first language. They can't redo the facial expression, they can't rely on reading lips. So it has been really challenging. Our refugee team has been amazing at being creative, making sure that they maintain that contact, that they make the person feel welcome, even though access and the community is not as open as we would like it to be, as it would normally be in most cases. So I think that has been a challenge, making people feel welcome and normalized in a situation that's inherently not normal.
Yes, thank you so much. So the next thing that I would like to ask Attorney Sennett is for you to speak on the extent of the issue of the vulnerable unaccompanied minor population coming to the U.S., why it's so dangerous, and how does even human trafficking come into play?
So to start, I would just say what we talk about with an unaccompanied minor is a child who is, so somebody under the age of 18 who's encountered by immigration and they don't have a parent or guardian with them, and they don't have evidence they're a US citizen or that they have lawful immigration status. And what we're seeing currently are large numbers at the border of these unaccompanied minors. So one of the reasons why we're seeing large numbers of unaccompanied minors and not necessarily adults is because adults are being turned around at the border and expelled under something called Title 42, which uses the COVID pandemic and cites that as the reason why they are not allowed to apply for asylum. They're not allowed to be here in the United States. Under former President Trump, they were taking the children and expelling them without any hearings. But there's something called the TVPRA, which is a law passed by Congress that provides special protections to unaccompanied minors. And those protections are specifically because unaccompanied minors are so vulnerable. So when we talk to or meet with unaccompanied minors, there are issues of violence. Many of our unaccompanied minors come from Northern Triangle countries, so that would be Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, where there are high rates of impunity in terms of government enforcing law. Also, high rates of violence, particularly gang violence. And also, there's a lot of gender-based violence. So many of the children are fleeing these. Some children are actually victims of trafficking in their country of origin, and trafficking can be any type of labor. So it could be farm work, it can be working in a restaurant, it can be working in an informal or formal workplace where the person is facing force, fraud, or coercion in order for that work to happen. It can also include sex trafficking, which is any sex act where there's something of value exchanged for that. And the main reason why we're very concerned about unaccompanied minors is because of the vulnerability of especially coming across the border where we have there are smugglers, but there are also human traffickers who want to use minors and other vulnerable immigrants in order to perform labor for them. And then the other aspect of the vulnerability comes once the minors in the United States, because they're usually being reunified with, hopefully reunified with a relative, but that could also be a family friend. It could be a parent that they haven't seen or they don't remember seeing because the parent left the country when they were 2 in order to support them. And those situations can create risks. So a parent who has a parent and a child have never had a parent-child relationship, there can be an issue there. the cost to come to the United States can be thousands of dollars. There can be an expectation that someone is going to repay those expenses. So that is why we have particular concerns about unaccompanied minors, because there's so many points of vulnerability over the course of the process. I don't know if that answered all of your questions, because I think it was a multi-part question.
Yes, it completely did. Thank you so much for the information. So, this next question is going to be for Chris. So we know you do a lot of work with the refugee population. So we want to know if there were any specific moments or situations this past year that really embodied what your organization does and your commitment to the cause.
Well, a lot of things, but I think I'd probably have to mention that just a couple of weeks after Connecticut went into a lockdown status, this was probably in March of last year, we had a refugee family from the Congo arriving, and it was going to be welcomed by a community group. So, you know, I mentioned across the country, there are about 200 refugee agencies. All of them have staff, and most of them use their staff and some volunteers to welcome families and to do all the things that I had listed before: connect them to healthcare, enroll the kids in school, help them learn English, help them get jobs, all of these things. Well, we have used a model, a slightly different approach to resettling refugees in Connecticut, where we recruit a group of volunteers in a community, and it can be a coalition of people from synagogue, a church, a mosque, a Rotary Club, even a college like UConn, students coming together, joining other people, coming to IRIS and saying basically, look, IRIS, we want to be part of this program to welcome refugees. We want to do something. We want to really participate. We don't just want to write checks. We don't just want to, you know, donate used clothing. We want to roll up our sleeves and actually work with and welcome refugees. How can you work with us? And we say, well, look, that's great. We'll train you on doing all of these things that my staff does. You're never going to be as good as my staff, but you'll be able to do a good job. We'll train you in all of these things, and we'll, you know, make sure you read a training manual. We'll ask you to fill out a detailed application. We're going to vet you to make sure you're a responsible group. You'll have to raise some money, and then we're going to place a refugee family with you, and you're going to do everything under our supervision, with our oversight. If you run into problems, get in touch with us, we'll help. But basically, you're going to run the show. Well, a family came last March from the Congo, and it was placed with one of these community groups. And I mean, this was brand new for all of us. This community group, you know, had to mask up and keep social distance from the refugee family. The refugee family was placed in an apartment. They had to basically stay, you know, keep to themselves for 2 weeks. But, you know, it has gone well, and they've adjusted, they've gotten jobs. The group loves it. I mean, you talk to people who participate in refugee resettlement, and they think it's the best thing they've ever done. So this is, I think, a lesson that we can continue to resettle refugees, even during a pandemic. We can use this community-based model, that our mission should not just be to provide services to refugees. I mean, you know, yes, we will provide services, and they will be high quality services, but we have another mission, and that is to educate Americans and to engage them in the process. And we try to do that as much as we can, and we try to encourage other refugee agencies to do the same, because that's how you build public support for refugee resettlement. And you cannot ask the public to support a foreign policy program like refugee resettlement if they don't know anything about it. How do you help them understand it? Engage them in the process. So, we want to reach the point where millions of Americans have had direct contact with refugees, have helped them get jobs, have enrolled kids in school, have tutored high school students, have helped high school students apply for colleges, have shown people where to shop, how to catch a bus, how to rake leaves, how to shovel snow. All of these experiences that refugees go through, they can really use a friend to guide them along the way. We want to reach a point where there are millions of Americans who've had this intimate contact with refugees, so that the refugee program will never, ever experience the problems and the attacks from our own administration that it went through over the past 4 years.
Yes, I love that. I think education is key. So just a quick follow-up question for that is, how involved is your organization in the life of the refugees that you work with? Is it until they're finally resettled, or do you just always continue to keep in touch with them?
Well, it starts with a lot of involvement at the beginning, and then over the months, it becomes less and less and less and less and less. The whole philosophy of refugee resettlement in this country is to help refugees get off to a good start, but to help them become self-sufficient as soon as possible, help them regain control over their lives. I mean, we've gotten some glimmers of experience into what a refugee goes through overseas. They're pushed around, they're persecuted, they're stopped at checkpoints, they're herded into refugee camps, they're told where to go and what they can do, and rations every Wednesday morning, and you can't leave the refugee camp to work. They have no control over their lives. When they come to the United States, we want to help them regain control over their lives. And sometimes that means having some tough policies, like, look, I'm sorry, you've got to get a job and pay your own rent and utilities. We've supported you for a while, but we cannot support you forever. And, there are other countries that do it differently. In Canada, refugees are not supposed to get jobs during their first year. They're supposed to focus on learning language and acculturating. Here in the United States, we want refugees to get jobs as soon as possible.
Yes, thank you so much. So following that, Attorney Sennett, in your own opinion, what do you think about the United States' actions on the refugee crisis in comparison to other countries, like Chris just mentioned, like Canada?
So it's difficult to compare to other countries just because this is the policy that we have. This is the policy that we have to work with. And this policy works really successfully with some of our clients. And we provide support up to 5 years after resettlement. And then part of that is because there's an ongoing legal process. So after 1 year, the refugee is applying for their permanent residence, their green card. 5 years in, we like to see if it's possible for them, if they can be applying for their citizenship. And the other part is that many times when we're working with refugees or recent asylees, both of them have the same option to apply for a relative, to file for a relative, but that process is taking like right around 2 years. So these are relatives like children, a spouse who could be in a location that's not safe abroad, that could be persecuted, that they're filing for, and there's a very long wait time for that. That's something that I do not like about refugee policy, but not having looked at how it's done in other countries, I can't speak to that. I do like the idea of having more time for refugees, especially those who do not have the English language fluency. But my main difficulty with our refugee policy right now as an immigration attorney is the wait times that our refugee clients are seeing in being reunited with their families, in getting their permanent residence, all of which is a delay in or delays in their basically their new chapter. So I can't speak to the policies in other countries at this point.
Yes, thank you for your answer. I think it's great. So I'd also like to ask you, how would, as you previously mentioned, a language barrier further complicate things? And do any of your organizations have multiple resources if particular groups are struggling with communication?
So our staff, so language barriers are a huge issue because if you are an American, many Americans do not speak a second language. Many Americans take years to learn a second language in school, and we're expecting our refugee clients to be getting their job, working, and somehow getting this second language. So when we're working with clients, we have staff who are fluent in the same language. We provide ESL classes. We have childcare during ESL classes, and we have separate classes so adults can work on their English language while their children also work on their English language. Because one of the main issues that we do see is childcare. But the thing that we can't do is send our clients to their workplace with an interpreter, send them to their job interviews, which may require English fluency with an interpreter. So that's a big obstacle to basically your settling down and having your new life and being comfortable with it. If you are afraid that you will walk out your front door and you might encounter someone who's not going to understand you. So, Chris, if you wanted to talk about the resources that you have.
So I agree 100% with Caroline. Language is the biggest hurdle for refugees. I mean, you know, it's what opens all the doors. It helps you understand the culture. It helps you meet people. It helps you get jobs. The better your English, the better your job in many cases. We've become a satellite of New Haven Adult Education so that we've got classes actually at our office when we were in person. Now, of course, they're remote. We have a family literacy program. So, you know, we were noticing over the years that many of the women, mothers in refugee families were staying at home. You know, refugees come from pretty traditional cultures, societies. The men were working, the women were staying at home. And despite our, you know, best efforts to get them to come out, they just weren't. So we had to develop a family literacy program where we said, bring your child to a program where your child can be in the next room or right down the hall, or maybe, you know, in the same room, but in the far corner, and you're in the other corner. You're learning English from volunteers. Your child is you know, getting school readiness or preschool work, and you know, you can make some progress learning English. So that works. I mean, some people call them a mommy and me program. That's not just for mothers. Fathers also, of course, are welcome. So anything we can do to help people learn English, but it is very tough. Many refugees haven't had a lot of experience in school. They've never learned a second language. They don't have skills and experience in learning languages. So it's been difficult, but it is really key to a refugee's success in this country is to learn the language. And sometimes I think maybe they're doing it the right way in Canada. You know, take a whole year to learn the language, learn the culture, maybe do some volunteer work, get some job training, and then you begin working. Because once you start working, you know, it is another big chunk of time where you might not be able to spend a lot of time learning English.
Yes, thank you. So in our last few minutes, I'd just like to ask you guys, what are some of the ways that students and people of the community can help in easing the transition of refugees?
I
Well,
mean, I'll go first because I mean, but I think we both have a lot to say. One of the things is that, so Chris was talking about how involved people are with the refugee resettlement, and that is something that where we do have volunteers. We have mentors who work with our families that are being resettled, and they are a key resource for those families. So we can set up a family with their beds, their house, and but it's our volunteers who really bring a lot of the heart in terms of working with people, working with families over a long time, sometimes over a lifetime, and having that really valuable relationship. So volunteering, working, being willing to work as a member of the community and being willing to volunteer. And of course, that's more difficult during COVID, but a lot of our volunteers have been calling and saying, I just got my vaccine. I want to go visit my mentees. I want to see how they're doing in school because they've been doing video calls, especially since some of our volunteers are elderly. And so there are all sorts of ways to volunteer to provide basically that community that has been so hard to provide during COVID. And I'd say that is probably one of the best ways. Um, there's always ways to donate money. There's ways to donate winter clothing, food. I think we distributed like 5,000 pounds of food during COVID because uh, people were having trouble. They were losing their jobs. They were losing hours. And there's always a need for that, but the human element is something that I think is really important. And I think that's something that students could absolutely contribute.
yeah, and I should mention that during the years of the Trump administration, most refugee agencies, I know ours did, probably SERI, and many others across the country, they went through a kind of emergency strategic planning process where they essentially said, well, if we have a president who is not going to be bringing more refugees here, or at least not the numbers that we should have, then we are going to do more with the refugees who are already here. So we have deepened our services in the areas, especially of education and employment, family literacy program that I mentioned. The other thing we did was, you know, we have a lot of expertise in helping people from all over the world, mainly refugees. But if there aren't going to be many refugees coming, why don't we shift and pivot a little bit and open up our doors to other immigrants in the community? They might not be refugees. They might not even be asylum seekers, that sort of next circle outside the refugees. They are undocumented immigrants who have kind of taken matters into their own hands, come into this country for safety, for freedom, and they need help. They're not eligible for the government services that refugees are eligible for. When they lose their jobs, there's no unemployment benefits. They don't have health care. They don't qualify for food stamps or cash assistance. So many refugee resettlement agencies, including ours, increased our services for undocumented immigrants. And it has really just expanded dramatically. I mean, we had a food pantry that was helping 80 people a week before the pandemic, 80 families. I just got an email an hour ago saying we helped 374 families this week. So there's a lot to do. The pandemic has really increased suffering of many families, especially undocumented immigrants. And organizations like Caroline's and ours are working with them, and we can use all the help we can get. We depend on volunteers. We're nonprofit. It means we're always short on resources. Our budget is never as large as we want it to be. We always have much more work than we can do. So the more volunteers, the better.
Thank you guys so much. You do amazing work, clearly. And I just want to thank you for joining me today as panelists and for the excellent information that you shared with us and the UConn community. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining in, and for any extra information or questions for our panelists, please reach out to our committee or check out our panelists' contact information on the symposium website. So I'd also ask for you to please join us for our last event of the day in just a few minutes, consisting of a presentation and Q&A by UConn Law Immigration Clinic's Valeria Gomez. So once again, thank you guys so much for being here today. I had a wonderful time. Our conversation was great. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Yes, thank you very much for really putting a spotlight on these issues. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, guys.